Well, I never shy away from controversy, and especially when it comes to habitat, hunting technique, strategy, and especially when you're using gadget and gizmos and different contraptions for your scent or whatever it might be. I really like to keep it real. And you know, going back to the late 80s, I have a lot of mid 80s, a lot of experience with broadheads and shooting deer all the way back to mid 80s with a bow. And of course, broadheads are very controversial. Not much different than Ford, Chevy, Dodge, but everyone has their favorites, their favorite types. And I'm going to go through the history of what I've experienced and why I'm using the type of broadhead I am today. And we're not even going to really focus on brand too much. I am not sponsored by a broadhead company, so I don't want you to think this is a sales pitch at the end to get you to buy a certain broadhead, but I'm just going to show you some real world experience. And I have these bucks behind me and around me, and the majority of them, my best bucks, have been shot with a bow. So the majority of these bucks on the wall are actually bow shot bucks. And I'm going to go through the type of broadheads I shot. Now I can be honest, you know, back in the mid 80s, I don't know if you remember the Satellite Titan broadheads, satellite broadheads. Wasp, I believe the Wasp broadheads in 1986 were the first ones I ever used. I believe they had replaceable blades. I used satellite broadheads. I shot a bear with a Satellite Titan in 1992 in Canada. So I have a lot of experience going back to those late 80s, early 90s with a variety of fixed blade broadheads, whether they were replaceable or not. And that's where I started. That's where my roots were. And we spent an awful amount of time tuning those broadheads in. I shot broadhead leagues. We were shooting cardboard silhouettes into sand. I really shot actually a lot of Thunderhead 125s. I think that was a basic. Then they came out with a Thunderhead 100. I used that. And so just a lot of muzzy. I can think of so many, and I'm going to leave out some names because we're always playing with them and tweaking and trying to get the best flying broadheads based on our arrow setup. And back then it was big arrows. I used 2317, Easton 2317 back in the day. And that guided that Satellite Titan pretty good. Big 5-inch blades or vanes so it could steer it. And broadheads have come a long ways. They fly true. And I'm just going to go through some of these bucks that I've shot. And you know, really back in the day, from 2000 or from 95 to 2010, I used almost exclusively rocket heads. This is one right here. I believe this was a Sidewinder. This might have been a Hammerhead 100. And I use these. I used a Wolverine, which was a 57 grain head, and real thin blades, but I shot a lot of bucks with those. And so these rocket heads, I'm looking over here, and this buck right here, actually, I shot it 1 year in the high shoulder, didn't find it, one speck of blood, and actually a year later during gun season, I was able to shoot it and get one of my rocket heads back. This is not the one, but it was encased in the above the shoulder, and I was able to get it back. That buck was doing really well at that time. I didn't hurt him too much. This one right here, shot, and I'm going to mix up some of these dates, but I think that was 2011. I shot him with a shuttle T. After 2010, in 2010 I had my most blunders of the year. I changed broadheads, arrows, sight, rest. I changed everything. I just had a lot of bad luck that year. It was my worst year ever in bow hunting, going back to 1986, and still is. I hope I don't have a repeat of that kind of year ever again, but I can't blame what happened on the broadheads. You never want to blame the broadhead. That's number one. But, you know, I really switched. That was the first buck, you know, with a fixed head with shuttle T. We go through these bucks right here. This one right here, this was a real nice buck. That I think that one was 2013. This one was 2011, but this one was a shuttle T as well. So I used a shuttle T in there for a few years. This one right behind me, that one was more like 2015, I think. And shot that one actually with a Carbon Express F15. You know, and again, I migrated through those 15 years of mechanicals and wanted to change something. So whether I was shooting the shuttle T or these F15s, that was a Carbon Express. I liked this because the penetration was awesome. They flew really well. But then at the same time, you can see the cutting width is not that great. So I really wanted something different from there even. So, but this buck right here, 34-yard shot, went right through him. He went about 50 yards and piled up. So, you know, I can't say anything bad about that. There's a buck right over here. This is Ohio public land buck, one of the ones we had lots of footage of. Really had a great hunt for this. Drove down the Monday before Thanksgiving. slept 20 minutes in the car out on the public land, and went in and shot him within an hour and a half. One of our target bucks, and that one was, if you can see that, that was the F15 Broadhead. And again, you know, not a lot of cutting width, and I like this head a lot. I love the penetration. Like I said, this arrow was zipped right through, but I wanted something different. While I'm over here, there's this buck right over here on the wall. I know it's close to Dylan right there. It's a 15-point shot in 2006 or 2007. That would have been a rocket head. Going through here, this was another rocket head buck right here. I believe he was 2005. I get these mixed up, but I think this one was 2003. That would have been a rocket head. That was definitely a Wolverine. I was using Wolverines at that time, where they're that little 57 grain head, 3-blade expandable. Same with this one. That was a little Wolverine 57. That was you know, rocket head style, just a lot shorter than that one right there. And I'm probably forgetting a couple here, but I went from the fixed blade when we were young, eventually switched over to the mechanicals for 15 years. I enjoyed them. I shot, during that 15 years, I'm sure I shot 60, 70, 80 deer with a bow. And then I've gone to the fixed blade. I wanted to go to an extreme. And then what I've really decided on now, and again, I'm not sponsored by you know, any broadhead company, and that would include Muzzy, but this is the Muzzy, I believe they call it the Trocar HB, and it's a hybrid. And what I like about these heads is you have the traditional fixed blades on there, and then you have the bleeder blades that give you a lot better cutting width. I also like these because, unlike the rocket heads and some of the other expandables that I use, they don't have to use rubber bands, and I don't have to fit them in some finagled way so that when I put them in my quiver and take out, they actually come apart. I've used some mechanicals like that. This one is very simple. You just put it on, shoot it, and it works. The buck I shot last year, I shot with this, and I can't remember if I used it the year before or not, but this is what I plan on using going into the season. Excuse me, right now. It flies really well, and I think you can make a case for all of them. I really like, if I'm using an expandable, if I went to an expandable again, I would definitely go with a very large cutting width. I don't expect that expandable. They say that it takes 10 to 20% out of the kinetic energy of your bow just to open those blades. So think about that. If you're using low poundage, and, you know, for example, if I'm using 60 pounds, I don't want to lose 12 pounds of penetration just because I'm using an expandable. But if I do, so I don't expect it to break shoulder. And everyone says, they always talk about their favorite broadhead will just blast right through shoulder. Well, if you're hitting that T of the shoulder where there's a crease in there and there's that ridge going through, just about, I don't believe any broadhead can break through that. If you're going through the blade of the shoulder blade, then almost every broadhead will go through that. But if you have large expanding blades, then they'll catch up and they might not penetrate. However, if you make a bad shot into the liver, the guts, the intestine, or even into the hip, and you're trying to hit that artery, or you're hoping that it hits it after a bad shot, then that large expandable will be the trick. What I find is I'm gearing up towards a good shot, and I want a little bone penetration, and I look at it like, even if I have a small hole from the broadhead that goes through the intestines or the guts, that deer is still going to die, and then it takes patience. And so it takes patience to wait. And if you know it was a gut or a heart or a intestine shot, you're going to have to give it at least a day. I find if it's true guts and you have food on the arrow, then you can give it 5 hours, it's going to be dead. But if you get it back in the intestines, I've seen intestine shot deer that are still alive 2 days later, and we never ever want that to happen. But that can happen, and whether you're shooting with a large expandable, a fixed blade, or a hybrid, you still have to be very smart after the shot. Do not pursue that deer. And if you have a bad shot like that, and that's the problem too, you can get a dog on a shot like that, and that dog 12 hours later and that deer's still alive, that dog can just push it for miles and never catch up over everyone else's land, whatever might happen. So a dog is great when the deer is dead, not so great when the deer is alive. But going back to these heads, I love the fixed blade because it's reliable. I never have to worry about it hitting a stick, and I think I've had that happen before, where one blade opens slightly and it takes a dive, a severe dive. But with a fixed blade, I think it has the ability to cut through a little bit of grass at times. You never can go through much at all, never want to or plan for it. But when it's bow hunting, we're not dealing with something that's 100% perfect. So I like the fixed blade because when I pull it out of a quiver and I shoot it, it's going to hit where I aim and I can rely on it. Now at the same time, if you have a wide fixed blade, which would be ideal, then you really have to steer it from the back end with some bigger vanes or a lot of tuning. And what I find is, shooting professionally back into the mid-90s and through the early 2000s and shooting all the time, 1,000 arrows a week, then when you had a really technical, tight, highly tuned setup, then any variance could make that change drastically. For example, a strong side wind. So you have a very tuned bow with broadheads that have the potential to steer the arrow, and if you have high winds, that could push that to the side and really wreak havoc. Where the smaller you go in the head size, the less planing there is. You can get away with smaller vanes, which react less to the wind, side to side. And so smaller is better for shooting, bigger is better for actually cutting and killing the deer. So what I find, again, I think the perfect balance, I've used the small fixed blade heads, I've used the large fixed blade heads that we had a really hard time tuning. I've used the mechanical heads. I can tell you one story, and I don't think that buck is here. I have a few at the Stockyard restaurant here in town. But that head right there, I had a buck that was severe angle, coming towards me, quartering towards me, but it was straight down. And so I love shooting those deer when it's on the top of the rib cage, just on this side of the spine. I hit that buck, knew I hit him. He jumped, came right here. Ended up shooting him in the spine with a second arrow. He gave me enough time. I could see blood on the grass. He ran, and I ended up shooting that buck 10 days later. He was on a doe. He was doing really well. I got my broadhead back from that. That was an expandable in 2010, one of my big mishaps. And that first shot just put a stripe down the side of his rib cage. So one blade opened. I found one blood on one blade and one vein. And that expandable just rode the outside of the deer and stuck in the ground straight down. And I got him 10 days later, and I could prove that. It was about a 10-inch gash. And so I got zero penetration, and that's what happens with some of the expandables too. If you're hitting severe angles, less than ideal shots, then there's a lot less room for error and margin of error. So to me, what it's come down to after, I think this would be my 33rd or 34th bow season. I'm aging myself greatly, but is that I really like these hybrids. I'm always tweaking, I'm always playing around, and don't get me started on my muzzleloader loads. That's the same thing. I love experimenting every year and shoot multiple different loads and shoot for long range accuracy, short. And when it comes to bows, it's no different. I really like this head right here. I like the idea, again, of those bleeder blades that give you wide, and it's muzzy, so they're very tough. That's always been true with muzzies back to when they used to advertise shooting through a 55-gallon metal drum. And then you have these fixed blades that are always there. Closed up, it's a very compact head, has a great chisel point that muzzies use for many years for breaking bone. And so I think I have the ideal setup for if I hit a shoulder blade, it's a smaller head, it's going to go through. It just has those two bleeder blades. I think these get outstanding penetration. The arrow lash went right through the deer, and the deer ran about 50, 75 yards and died. And I think you have the right width in something like this. It's compact, so it flies well. So you get great penetration, flies well. You have two good bleeder blades that give you another width on cutting width. And then you have the fixed blade reliability, and then there's no rubber bands on this. So again, I'm not sponsored by Muzzy. This is just what I've chosen after 30 some years of hunting and what I've narrowed it down to so far. That doesn't mean it won't change by mid-season, but I enjoy playing with these broadheads. There's a case to be made for each one. What I can't stand is hunters bashing other hunters online about which broadhead they use. How silly is that? We're all going out in the woods and hunting. We're trying to take ethical shots. And whatever broadhead you choose this year, kind of think about those pluses and minuses of each one. Really put some thought into it. Don't use a broadhead just because some celebrity bow hunter tells you to use that head in particular. Hunters against hunters, hunters bashing hunters. And I guess maybe I'm bashing hunters by saying this, but I can't stand it. I can't stand the turmoil between hunters. There are so many quality broadheads on the market. They all have their pluses and minuses. really think through thoughtfully about your situation, your skill set, and how these broadheads match to your style. And you can bet that this will probably not be the last broadhead I ever use. I really am leaning towards these hybrid types that have a little bit of an expandable and then have the fixed blade capabilities and the attributes that go with that smaller head, compact head with the bleeder blades. And bottom line though, all these bucks around, I shot a lot with a rocket head, fixed blades, shot them with this one right here, the hybrids, and you can get the job done. You take great ethical shots with your broadheads this year, and that really, when it boils down to it, is the most important.